Imagine for a moment what it must have been like when the entire globe seemed to catch fire all at once, when battles raged from places so cold your breath turned to ice crystals before it left your mouth, all the way to islands where the heat was so oppressive that men could barely think straight. You had millions upon millions of young Americans, most of them barely old enough to vote, getting stuffed onto ships and planes, heading toward destinations that sounded more like something out of an adventure novel than real geography. These weren't places they'd ever dreamed of visiting. Hell, most of them couldn't have found these spots on a map if you'd given them a week to search. And then comes the part that really makes you stop and think. When all those soldiers finally arrived at their assigned posts, after days or weeks of travel that left them exhausted and disoriented, you know what was waiting for them. Absolutely nothing. No buildings, no shelter, not even the most basic sort of roof to keep the weather off their backs. Just mud that sucked at their boots, rain that fell in sheets so thick you couldn't see 5 feet ahead, and whatever brutal natural conditions the local climate decided to throw at them on any given day. The brass back in Washington understood they had a serious problem on their hands. You couldn't just leave hundreds of thousands of men exposed to the elements and expect them to fight effectively. But shipping traditional building materials across thousands of miles of ocean, through waters crawling with enemy submarines, while also trying to move tanks and ammunition and food and everything else an army needs, that was a logistical impossibility. So what happened next is one of those stories that doesn't get told nearly enough because it doesn't involve heroic charges or dramatic aerial dogfights. Instead, it's about problem solving on a scale that's hard to wrap your head around. The military establishment came up with something that looked almost ridiculous when you first saw it. This strange curved structure made from sheets of corrugated steel, bent into a half-circle shape that reminded you of a tunnel cut lengthwise. They called it the Quonset hut, named after the place where the first ones were built, and while it might not have looked like much, this simple design ended up being one of the most important pieces of equipment in the entire war. Now let me throw some numbers at you that'll help you understand just how massive this operation was. We're talking about more than 100,000 of these structures getting built during the war years. Think about that for a second. Not 100, not 1,000, but over 100,000 individual buildings, each one capable of housing dozens of men or serving whatever purpose the military needed at that particular moment. It's the kind of production number that sounds made up, like someone added an extra zero by mistake, but it's absolutely true. Picture yourself as a soldier stepping off a transport ship onto some godforsaken chunk of rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the summer of 1943. The island might have been controlled by the enemy just days or even hours before, and now you're standing there watching as teams of men with wrenches and hammers start bolting together these curved steel sections. By the time the sun goes down that same day, there's a complete building standing where there was nothing but bare ground that morning. It's ready to house people, ready to store supplies, ready to serve as a hospital or a command center or whatever else needs doing. If that doesn't sound like something pulled straight from the pages of a science fiction story, I don't know what does, but it was happening over and over again across the entire world. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention when people talk about World War II. Everyone focuses on the shooting and the bombing, the tanks rolling across Europe and the carriers dueling in the Pacific, and sure, those things mattered enormously. But wars, real wars involving millions of people spread across continents, those wars get won or lost based on whether you can keep your people fed and sheltered and healthy enough to fight. The Germans had their concrete bunkers and their elaborate fortification systems. The Japanese had dug themselves into caves and built underground complexes that were incredibly difficult to root out. But the Americans, they had these portable buildings that could be packed flat, shipped anywhere in the world, and assembled by people who'd never built anything more complicated than a backyard shed back home. That might not sound as impressive as a fortress, but when you're trying to fight a war that spans half the planet, being able to create shelter anywhere and everywhere you go becomes a massive strategic advantage. And if you're sitting there thinking that a building is just a building, that there's nothing particularly special about having a roof over your head, then you haven't really grasped what made these huts so revolutionary. These things didn't just disappear when the fighting stopped in 1945. They became woven into the fabric of American society in ways nobody anticipated. When the soldiers came flooding back home, there was a housing crisis unlike anything the country had seen before. Suddenly you had all these surplus Quonset huts sitting around, and somebody had the bright idea to convert them into temporary housing for veterans and their families. College campuses set them up as dormitories. Towns used them as community centers and churches and even restaurants. Some of these buildings are still standing right now, more than 70 years later, their steel skins rusted and worn but still keeping the rain out, still serving whatever purpose their current owners have found for them. They're monuments to a time when American industry was running at full throttle, when the entire country was focused on a single goal and nothing was going to stand in the way of achieving it. So what we're going to explore here is how this whole phenomenon came to be, how the design got developed in the first place, how the production ramped up to truly staggering levels, what it was actually like for the men who lived and worked inside these curved steel shells, how they spread to literally every corner of the globe where American forces went, and how something that was meant to last maybe a few months or years at most ended up becoming a permanent part of the historical landscape. It's a story about metal and muscle and the kind of practical American ingenuity that doesn't always make it into the history books, but probably deserves to be there just as much as the stories of battles and generals. And I guarantee you'll never look at one of those half-cylinder buildings the same way once you understand what they represented and what they accomplished. The calendar had rolled around to late 1941, and the people running the American military machine were staring at what can only be described as a nightmare scenario from a logistics perspective. The attack that happened in Hawaii on that December morning had forced the nation's hand, pushing the United States into a conflict that was going to require sending troops to places that were so far away they might as well have been on another planet. You had millions of young men who were going to need to be shipped out, and every single one of them was going to require the basic necessities of life, food in their bellies, water to drink, and something resembling shelter to protect them from whatever the local weather decided to throw at them. The challenge was crystal clear to anyone who thought about it for more than 5 minutes. When you've got an army that's constantly moving, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating, sometimes just shifting from one theatre of operations to another, how do you keep all those people housed? The old approach, building traditional wooden barracks like you'd see at bases back in the States, that took way too much time. You needed skilled carpenters, you needed vast quantities of lumber, you needed weeks or even months to get everything constructed and ready for occupancy. And the idea of loading up ships with thousands of tons of wood and nails and sending all that material halfway around the world while you were also trying to move weapons and ammunition and fuel and medical supplies and food, well, that was clearly not going to work. The military brass needed something completely different, something that could be assembled quickly, something that didn't weigh more than absolutely necessary, something portable enough to move wherever it needed to go, and something tough enough to survive in environments ranging from Arctic tundra where the temperature could drop to dozens of degrees below zero, all the way to tropical jungles where the humidity made everything rot and the rain fell in torrents that turned the ground into soup. This wasn't just about making soldiers comfortable, not by a long shot. When you've got men fighting in North Africa where the sun could cook you alive during the day and the temperature plummeted at night, or on tiny Pacific islands where the jungle was so thick you could barely hack your way through it, or up in Alaska where the cold could literally kill you if you weren't careful, those men couldn't afford to be weakened by constant exposure to the elements. A soldier who's sick from sleeping in the rain, or exhausted from never getting a decent night's rest, or suffering from frostbite or heat exhaustion, that soldier isn't just one less rifle on the line. That soldier becomes a drain on resources, needs medical attention, needs to be evacuated, needs to be replaced. It creates a cascading series of problems that can turn into lost battles and lost lives. The planners understood that solving the shelter problem wasn't some luxury or nice-to-have feature. It was absolutely fundamental to the entire war effort. The question wasn't whether they'd figure something out, because failure wasn't an option. It was about how quickly they could design and deploy a solution before the problem spiraled completely out of control. That's when the Navy decided to take charge of the situation. Even before that fateful December morning, back in the early months of 1941, when war was looking increasingly inevitable but hadn't quite arrived yet, the Navy had already recognized that its bases were going to need to expand dramatically. They were looking at establishing facilities in places they'd never operated before, islands and coastlines all across the Pacific and Atlantic, and they knew that standard construction methods weren't going to cut it. The Navy didn't want tents that would rip apart in the first strong wind that came along. They didn't want wooden structures that would start rotting the moment they got hit by tropical rainfall. What they wanted was a building that could be broken down into components, packed into crates, shipped to literally anywhere on Earth, and then assembled using nothing more than basic hand tools and a crew of men who didn't necessarily have any construction experience. The kind of structure that sailors and soldiers could throw together in a matter of hours rather than days or weeks, something that would be standing and functional almost immediately after it arrived at its destination. At that particular moment in history, the American military had been looking at a design that the British had used during the previous World War. It was called the Nissen hut, invented back in 1916 by a British officer whose innovation had helped solve similar problems during the fighting in France. The Nissen hut was also built around a curved steel frame, and the British had deployed thousands of them across the Western Front with reasonable success. But when American planners examined the design, they decided it wasn't quite right for their purposes. They wanted something simpler in its construction, something more robust in its engineering, something that would be better suited to the mass production techniques that American factories had been perfecting over the previous decades. What they wanted, in other words, was a distinctly American interpretation of the concept, something that would bear the stamp of American industrial efficiency and practical design philosophy. This is where a place called Quonset Point in Rhode Island enters the picture. That location became the site where the Navy commissioned the construction of the first prototype of what would eventually be known by the name of that very place. The timing was incredibly tight. With the entire nation mobilizing for what everyone knew was going to be total war, there was a desperate race to build not just the weapons and vehicles and ships that would do the fighting, but also the entire supporting infrastructure that would house and sustain the men who would be doing that fighting. So by the time American soldiers started boarding transports in the early weeks of 1942, heading out toward destinations they could barely pronounce, let alone locate on a map, the foundation for their future accommodations had already been established. What appeared to be nothing more than a simple curved shell of corrugated metal was actually the solution to one of the most pressing logistical challenges of the entire conflict. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't the sort of thing anyone would choose if they had unlimited time and resources, but in a world where time and resources were the scarcest commodities of all, it was exactly what was needed. Without this innovation, you would have had thousands upon thousands of men left completely exposed in the field, vulnerable not just to enemy action, but to the relentless assault of weather and terrain and disease that could kill just as surely as bullets and bombs. This wasn't about creating beautiful architecture or winning design awards. It was about survival in the most basic sense of that word. And America was preparing to demonstrate that its ability to solve these kinds of practical problems quickly and on an enormous scale was going to be one of its greatest weapons in the coming struggle. When the Navy put out the call for this new type of structure back in 1941, the contract ended up going to a group of architects and engineers working with the George A. Fuller Company, operating out of the Davisville Naval Construction Battalion Center there in Rhode Island. The mission they were given sounded straightforward enough if you described it in simple terms, but actually accomplishing it was going to require some serious innovation. They needed to create a building that would be light enough to ship efficiently, cheap enough to produce in massive quantities, designed so it could be packed completely flat for transport, and simple enough that men with minimal training could assemble it using only the most basic tools you could imagine. On top of all that, the structure had to be incredibly rugged. capable of standing up to tropical heat that could melt asphalt, Arctic cold that could freeze diesel fuel solid, and everything in between those extremes. The design they eventually settled on was a masterpiece of simplicity. Imagine taking a cylinder, cutting it in half lengthwise, and standing it up on its flat edge. That's essentially what a Quonset hut looked like, a semicircular arch made from corrugated steel sheets, formed into a structure that measured 16 feet wide and 36 feet long in its initial configuration. That curved shape wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it served a crucial structural purpose. The arch distributed weight and force incredibly efficiently, which meant that wind and rain and snow would slide right off the surface instead of accumulating and creating stress points that could cause collapse. At each end of this steel tunnel, they installed plywood panels that could be fitted with doors or windows or ventilation openings depending on what the climate demanded and what purpose the hut would serve. The interior could be lined with insulation if the hut was going to be used in extreme temperatures, or it could be left bare if that kind of protection wasn't necessary. The entire assembly sat on a foundation that could be as simple as some wooden skids or as permanent as a concrete slab, depending on how long the hut was expected to remain in place and what kind of ground it was being built on. The very first prototypes went up at Quonset Point during the middle of 1941, which is why the design ended up being named after that location. These weren't luxury accommodations by any stretch of the imagination, they weren't going to win any architecture competitions, but they were precisely what the Navy had asked for. Each hut could be disassembled and packed into crates that were compact enough to fit into the cargo holds of ships and transport planes, then shipped thousands of miles across oceans and continents, and finally reassembled at the destination. A work crew consisting of just 6 or 8 men could have one of these huts completely erected and ready for use within a single day. When you compare that to the weeks of labour that went into hammering together traditional wooden barracks, you begin to understand why the Navy immediately recognised that they'd struck gold with this design. Of course, the initial design wasn't perfect right out of the gate. That would have been asking too much. Those first huts with their 16-foot width turned out to be too cramped for a lot of the uses the military had in mind. It didn't take long before the engineers went back to the drawing board and expanded the design to 20 feet wide, which provided significantly more usable interior space. Eventually, they developed even larger variants, some of them 40 feet wide, that could serve as everything from mess halls where hundreds of men could eat at once, to offices where entire command staffs could work, to chapels where services could be held for soldiers who wanted some connection to their faith even in the middle of a war zone. The modular nature of the design meant you could link multiple huts together if you needed even more space, or you could extend them lengthwise, or you could modify them on the fly to meet whatever specific needs arose. That kind of flexibility turned out to be absolutely priceless when you were operating in war zones where requirements could change literally overnight as tactical situations evolved. By the time late 1941 rolled around, the Navy had already started placing orders that ran into the thousands, and those numbers would only grow as the months went on. The design had been finalized and locked in, and factories across the country began the process of retooling their production lines to stamp out those corrugated steel panels in enormous quantities. The Quonset hut was officially entering mass production even as America was still processing the shock and trauma of that December attack. So when US troops hit the beaches at Guadalcanal in August of 1942, beginning the long and bloody campaign to take back the Pacific one island at a time, those troops found that the huts were already there waiting for them, crates of components ready to be unpacked and assembled into instant shelter. It's easy now, with the benefit of decades of hindsight, to look back and think that the Quonset hut was some inevitable development, something that was bound to happen one way or another. But that's not how it actually worked. This design emerged from a very specific moment of crisis and urgency, born from the marriage of American industrial capability and practical engineering thinking. Without Quonset Point, without that Navy contract, without the quick and creative work of those engineers who were willing to think outside the box, the entire war might have unfolded very differently, particularly in the Pacific Theatre, where logistics were absolutely critical. The elegant simplicity of the Quonset hut was its greatest strength. Steel arches, plywood ends, and an implicit promise that no matter where the military sent its troops, no matter how remote or hostile the location, those men would have a place they could retreat to at the end of the day, somewhere that offered at least basic protection from the elements, even if they were only going to be there for a single night before moving on to the next objective. Once the engineers had finalized the design in 1941 and gotten the Navy's approval, the United States didn't just start building Quonset huts at a modest pace. They unleashed the full fury of American industrial production on the problem. The country's manufacturing sector was already shifting into high gear to produce Liberty ships that would carry supplies across the Atlantic, Sherman tanks that would roll across Europe and fight in the Pacific, and B-17 bombers that would pound enemy positions from the air. Adding another product to that list might have seemed like a minor addition, just one more item on an already overwhelming to-do list. But the Quonset hut ended up becoming one of the most prolific products of the entire war, with production numbers that rivaled or exceeded many supposedly more important pieces of equipment. By the time 1945 arrived and the fighting finally stopped, more than 100,000 of these huts had rolled out of American factories, enough structures to house entire armies, enough buildings to equip hundreds of bases scattered across every continent on Earth. How did they manage to produce them in such staggering quantities? The answer lies in the same formula that powered American wartime industry across the board, the principle of mass production taken to its logical extreme. Factories all over the country were retooled and reconfigured to stamp out corrugated steel sheets in continuous runs, to cut plywood panels to exact specifications, and to package complete kits that contained every single component needed for assembly, every nut and bolt and washer and instruction sheet, everything required to transform a pile of parts into a functional building. Each individual hut, when broken down into its component parts and packed for shipping, weighed approximately 5 tons. That might sound like a lot until you realize that those 5 tons could be loaded into the hold of a Liberty ship right alongside jeeps and rations and ammunition, and then offloaded at any port anywhere in the world that had even the most basic cargo handling equipment. The Fuller Company and the other contractors who got involved in production didn't waste time creating complicated blueprints or custom specifications for different orders. Every hut was built to the same standardized design, which meant that factory workers could manufacture them using assembly line techniques very similar to how automobile plants built cars. The dimensions were predictable and consistent, the parts were completely interchangeable between different huts, and the assembly instructions were simple enough that someone with no construction experience could follow them successfully. A crate of Quonset hut components was essentially a giant construction set for adults, except instead of building a toy, you were building the infrastructure that would support a global military campaign. The numbers really do tell the story better than anything else could. During 1942 alone, the Navy placed orders for more than 25,000 huts almost immediately after the design was proven, and production rates only accelerated from there as the war expanded. Factories in Rhode Island, where the whole program had started, in New Jersey, where industrial capacity was enormous, and later in facilities spread across the Midwest that had previously been making completely different products, all of these plants worked around the clock in shifts that never stopped. By 1943, entire cargo ships were leaving American ports with holds full of nothing but Quonset hut kits and the men who had been trained to assemble them. The pace of production was so frantic and relentless that huts were often being built faster than the military's logistics people could figure out exactly where each one should be deployed, which meant that stockpiles began accumulating at major bases, waiting to be distributed to wherever they'd ultimately be needed. The real miracle of the whole operation, though, was how incredibly few men it actually took to erect one of these structures. 6 soldiers with some wrenches and hammers could have a complete hut standing in less than a full day's work. You didn't need cranes or other heavy equipment, you didn't need skilled carpenters who'd spent years learning their trade, You didn't need engineers on site to supervise every step of the process. You just needed manpower and a crate full of parts and some basic competence with simple tools. That speed of construction meant that islands that had just been captured from the enemy could be transformed into fully functioning military bases almost overnight. A landing strip would be carved out of the jungle, and within days that airstrip would have barracks for the pilots who'd fly from it, kitchens where mess crews could prepare food, offices where commanding officers could plan operations, medical facilities where wounded men could be treated, storage buildings for ammunition and supplies. Everything you needed for a working base materializing out of nothing in a matter of days rather than months. It's worth taking a moment to compare this capability to what the enemy forces were dealing with. While German troops were digging themselves into elaborate bunker systems that took tremendous amounts of time and resources to construct, and while Japanese garrisons were burrowing into caves and underground complexes that were incredibly difficult to build, American forces were putting up steel structures that rose from bare ground in hours. It wasn't glamorous or impressive in a visual sense. Nobody was going to write poems about the beauty of a Quonset hut, but it meant that wherever the American flag got planted, a functioning military base would follow close behind, usually so quickly that it seemed almost magical. By the time the war ended in 1945, the production figures for Quonset huts had reached levels that rivaled some of the biggest hardware programs of the entire conflict. These weren't just buildings providing shelter. They were a symbol of America's ability to outproduce, outsupply, and outbuild its enemies on a scale that those enemies simply couldn't match. It was one thing to send soldiers overseas to fight. That was something any nation with sufficient population could do. It was something else entirely to give those soldiers a ready-made infrastructure waiting for them in crates, structures that could be unpacked and assembled wherever they happened to land, ensuring that they'd have shelter and working spaces and medical facilities and all the other things that made the difference between an army that could sustain operations indefinitely and an army that would gradually wear itself down through exposure and exhaustion. For the average American soldier, living inside a Quonset hut was an experience completely unlike anything most of them had ever encountered before they put on a uniform. For a huge number of these young men, this was literally the first time they'd ever left their home state, let alone travelled to another continent. Suddenly, they found themselves sleeping in a curved shell made of corrugated steel, planted on soil thousands of miles from anything they'd ever known, and they had to adapt to this strange new reality, whether they liked it or not. These structures definitely weren't luxury cabins. Nobody was going to confuse them with the houses these men had grown up in back in small towns across America. But when you compared them to the alternative of sleeping in a canvas tent that leaked every time it rained and provided zero protection from the cold, they seemed like pretty decent accommodations. The interior spaces could be modified and adapted depending on which theatre of war you were in. Down in the South Pacific, where the heat and humidity were absolutely brutal, the huts were often lined with whatever insulation materials could be scrounged up, trying to keep the interior temperatures from becoming completely unbearable, and screens were added to all the openings to provide at least some defence against the clouds of mosquitoes that could drive men half mad with their constant attacks. In colder climates, and you had Quonset huts going up everywhere from Alaska, where winter temperatures could kill an unprepared man in minutes, all the way to northern Europe, where the fighting during winter months was its own special kind of hell. These huts would be fitted with stoves for heating, sometimes one at each end of the structure, to try to distribute warmth more evenly. Wooden floors kept men's feet off the mud and standing water that seemed to be a constant feature of military encampments, and improvised partitions made from whatever materials were available gave at least a tiny hint of privacy in spaces where dozens of men might be living in close quarters. Still, if you asked veterans years later what they remembered about living in Quonset huts, a lot of them would tell you about how loud they were, how every sound seemed to echo off those curved metal walls, and how the temperature inside could swing wildly between day and night, sweltering during daylight hours and then getting uncomfortably cold once the sun went down. But here's the thing that's really important to understand about these huts. They weren't just barracks where soldiers slept. They were incredibly flexible structures that could be adapted to serve whatever purpose the military needed at any given moment. Some huts got converted into mess halls, large spaces where hundreds of men would line up 3 times a day to get their rations, eating standing up or sitting on whatever they could find, because there often wasn't room for proper tables and chairs. Other huts were transformed into field hospitals, with rows of cots lining both sides and medical personnel working in conditions that were far from ideal but infinitely better than trying to treat wounded men out in the open. The smell of antiseptic and blood became permanently embedded in the wood and metal of these hospital huts, and decades later some of them still carried that distinctive odour. There were huts that served as chapels, with crude altars constructed under those curved roofs, where soldiers who were scared and far from home could sing hymns and try to find some small measure of comfort in familiar rituals, even though they were thousands of miles from the churches they'd grown up in. Command posts were set up in huts, with maps covering the walls and radio operators maintaining communication with higher headquarters and forward units. Storage depots filled with ammunition and supplies occupied other huts, carefully guarded because their contents were literally the lifeblood of military operations. Some huts even became classrooms where soldiers received training in everything from jungle warfare to language basics for whatever region they'd be operating in. And in a few cases, huts were turned into makeshift theatres where projectors would show movies sent from home, giving men a few hours of escape from the reality of their situation. If a particular function needed to happen under a roof, you could bet that somewhere a Quonset hut was being pressed into service for that purpose. A soldier arriving on a place like Guadalcanal in 1943, stepping off a landing craft onto a beach that might have been contested just days earlier, would have looked inland and seen a sprawling collection of these curved structures rising up almost overnight, transforming what had been raw jungle into something that at least vaguely resembled a functioning military installation. The huts provided a strange sense of permanence and order in environments that were otherwise completely alien and actively hostile to human life. They became symbols of American resourcefulness and organizational capability, physical proof that no matter how remote or challenging the location, the US military could establish itself and begin operations with remarkable speed. Of course, living in these huts wasn't without its significant downsides and challenges. Those steel walls, while structurally sound, had the unfortunate property of magnifying every sound. When tropical rainstorms hit, and in many parts of the Pacific and Southeast Asia these storms could drop inches of rain in hours, the noise inside the hut became absolutely deafening, making conversation impossible and sleep difficult. In tropical regions, the combination of steel construction and inadequate ventilation meant that the interior could feel like an oven during the day, with temperatures rising to levels that made it genuinely dangerous to stay inside for extended periods. The ventilation systems, such as they were, often proved completely inadequate for the conditions. Humidity could warp the wooden end panels, creating gaps that let in insects and rain. But soldiers being soldiers, they adapted to these conditions with the kind of ingenuity that military life seems to breed. They rigged up makeshift fans using salvaged motors and scrap materials. They cut additional windows and vents when the official openings proved insufficient. They did whatever it took to make these structures livable because the alternative was even worse. Letters that soldiers wrote home during the war often mentioned these huts, sometimes with a sense of humour about the strange circumstances they found themselves in, sometimes with complaints about the discomforts they had to endure, but almost always with an underlying tone of gratitude that there was at least something standing between them and the full force of whatever the local environment wanted to throw at them. One Marine who was stationed on a Pacific island wrote to his family back in Iowa, saying that the hut he lived in wasn't much to look at and it sure wasn't comfortable, but it kept the rain from drowning him in his sleep, and that was about all a man could reasonably ask for when he was this far from home. And perhaps what mattered most, even more than the physical protection they provided, was the psychological impact these huts had. They offered a small slice of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. You could hang your personal gear on a nail driven into the wooden framing, you could line up your cot in the same spot every night, and you could know that for at least a few hours while you tried to sleep, you weren't completely at the mercy of the jungle or the desert or the tundra outside those curved walls. For a young man who was thousands of miles from everything he'd ever known, scared half the time and exhausted the other half, that tiny measure of comfort and routine was worth more than you could possibly quantify. The hut might not have been home, but it was the closest thing to home that existed in that particular corner of hell, and that mattered enormously for morale and mental health in ways that the military planners probably hadn't fully anticipated when they first approved the design. The Quonset hut didn't remain confined to American military bases. It spread across the entire surface of the planet like some kind of benign industrial virus, following the movement of US forces wherever those forces went during the course of the war. From the beaches where Allied troops landed in Normandy on that crucial June morning in 1944, to remote jungle islands in New Guinea, where the fighting was some of the most brutal and exhausting of the entire Pacific campaign, these distinctive half-moon shelters became an integral part of the landscape. It didn't matter how isolated or hostile the location might be, if you went there looking. Odds were extremely good that you'd find a cluster of Quonset huts forming the core infrastructure of whatever military presence existed there. In the Pacific Theatre, these structures proved to be absolutely indispensable to the entire island-hopping campaign. When Marines stormed ashore at Tarawa in late 1943, engaging in some of the most vicious close quarters fighting the war would see, or when they landed on Iwo Jima in early 1945 for a battle that would become legendary for its brutality, and the famous photograph of the flag raising, the job of establishing a foothold, wasn't finished once the shooting stopped. You had to build infrastructure, and you had to build it fast. Airfields needed control towers where officers could coordinate flights, radio rooms packed with equipment for maintaining communication, weather stations so pilots would know what conditions they'd be flying into, maintenance shops where mechanics could keep aircraft flying. Instead of waiting for weeks while traditional construction crews worked at their usual pace, the military would bring in crates full of Quonset hut components, crews would start assembling them immediately, and within a matter of days you'd have a bare coral island bristling with functional buildings. Some of the larger bases that got established in the Pacific ended up with hundreds upon hundreds of these huts arranged in neat rows like a small city, complete with roads between them and signs indicating which hut served which function, creating these strange temporary settlements in places where nobody had lived before and where, in many cases, nobody would live again once the military moved on. Over in the European theatre, the huts proved just as critical to operations, even though the nature of the fighting there was very different from the Pacific. After D-Day, when Allied forces punched through the German defences and began their drive across France toward Germany itself, Quonset huts followed right behind the advancing armies. They started appearing in Normandy almost immediately, pressed into service as field hospitals where doctors and nurses worked frantically to save the lives of men who'd been wounded in the heavy fighting, as offices where logistics officers tried to manage the impossible task of keeping supplies moving forward to units that were consuming ammunition and fuel at rates that seemed almost incomprehensible, and as barracks where exhausted soldiers could grab a few hours of sleep before going back into combat. When winter arrived and the fighting moved into the Ardennes, where the Germans would launch their last major offensive in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Battle of the Bulge, those Quonset huts became heated shelters that quite literally saved lives, giving troops a place to warm up and recover from the brutal cold of the Belgian forests where men were fighting and dying in snowdrifts. But perhaps some of the most surprising deployments, the ones that really demonstrated just how versatile these structures were, happened in extreme climates that represented the absolute limits of human habitation. Up in Alaska and throughout the Aleutian Islands, where American and Japanese forces fought a largely forgotten campaign in conditions that were among the worst imaginable, Quonset huts were built to withstand winds that could reach hurricane force and temperatures that dropped far below zero. Engineers had to develop special anchoring systems to keep the huts from simply blowing away, and additional insulation had to be added to prevent the interiors from becoming death traps. Down in North Africa, on the other end of the temperature spectrum, the huts were set up in dusty desert camps, where the sun beat down mercilessly, and the temperature during the day could literally cook a man alive. Interestingly, those curved steel roofs that seemed like they'd just trap heat turned out to actually work pretty well in the desert because they reflected a lot of that solar radiation away, rather than absorbing it the way canvas tents did. In every imaginable environment, from steaming jungles to frozen wastelands, the same basic principle applied. A building that could be shipped as a flat-pack kit and raised in a matter of hours was infinitely more practical than any traditional construction method. The global footprint of these huts by the time the war ended in 1945 was absolutely staggering when you really stopped to think about it. There were Quonset huts standing on every single continent except Antarctica, and given the military's penchant for setting up bases in the most unlikely places, it wouldn't be entirely surprising if a few had made it even there for some specialized research or observation purpose. Soldiers developed a running joke that you could always tell where American forces had been simply by scanning the horizon for those distinctive steel half-circles. They became as much a marker of American military presence as the flag itself, instantly recognizable even to civilians in occupied or liberated territories who had never seen anything quite like them before the Americans showed up. And it wasn't just American forces who ended up using them either. Allied nations received substantial quantities of Quonset huts through the Lend-Lease program, that massive effort to supply friendly nations with American equipment and materials. British Commonwealth forces set them up across their far-flung empire. Australian troops used them in the Pacific, and in one of the more surprising developments, even the Soviet Union received shipments of these huts and put them to use in their own massive military operations. The huts had become universal because they simply worked better than any alternative anyone had come up with, and because no other country on Earth had solved the problem of mobile, rapidly deployable housing at anything approaching the scale that American industry had achieved. The structures became so ubiquitous, so completely ordinary within the context of military operations, that many soldiers just assumed they'd been around forever and would continue to exist permanently. The huts turned barren islands that had never supported human habitation into functioning cities within weeks. They brought order and structure to chaotic battle zones, and they provided troops with the basic infrastructure necessary to sustain military operations thousands upon thousands of miles from the nearest American soil. If you accept the premise that modern warfare is fundamentally about logistics and supply chains as much as it is about actual combat, then the Quonset hut deserves recognition as one of America's most effective weapons during the entire conflict. By the time the last shots were fired and the surrender documents were signed, it genuinely didn't matter whether you were on some tiny atoll in the Pacific that most Americans couldn't locate on a map if you gave them an hour to search, or in a farmyard somewhere in France that had recently been liberated from occupation, or at some remote observation post in the Arctic where the sun disappeared for months at a time. You were going to see those same curved roofs standing against whatever sky happened to be overhead. They were tangible proof that America hadn't just sent soldiers overseas to do the fighting. It had shipped an entire portable civilization along with those soldiers, ensuring that they had everything they needed to live and work and fight effectively, no matter where in the world they happened to find themselves at any given moment. When the guns finally stopped firing in August of 1945 and the world began the long, difficult process of transitioning from total war back to something resembling peace, most observers would have predicted that the Quonset hut would disappear, along with all the other temporary measures and emergency solutions that had characterized the war years. After all, these structures had been explicitly designed to be temporary, quick fixes for an urgent crisis that everyone assumed would end once the fighting stopped. But history had other plans. Instead of fading away into obscurity or getting scrapped for their metal content, these steel arches began a completely unexpected second life, one that would end up shaping the landscape and culture of post-war America in ways that absolutely nobody could have anticipated back when the first prototypes were being bolted together at Quonset Point. The immediate question facing military planners in the aftermath of victory was simple but daunting. What exactly do you do with more than 100,000 surplus buildings? The military didn't need them anymore, at least not in anything like the quantities that had been necessary during wartime, and warehousing that many structures would have been impractical and expensive. So a significant number were broken down and sold off as scrap metal, feeding into the industrial machinery of a nation that was retooling from war production back to consumer goods. But tens of thousands of others were either shipped back to the United States or simply left standing at the overseas bases where they'd been erected, waiting to find new purposes. The timing of this surplus couldn't have been more perfect because America was dealing with its own severe housing shortage. You had millions of young men streaming back home from Europe and the Pacific, and a substantial number of them were taking advantage of the GI Bill's education benefits, flooding into colleges and universities that were completely unprepared for such a massive influx of students. Cities were struggling to house returning veterans and their families, many of whom had gotten married during the war or were starting families now that the men were finally home. The demand for housing far outstripped the available supply, and traditional construction methods simply couldn't close that gap quickly enough. Quonset huts stepped in to fill the void. All across the United States, colleges and universities started setting up entire villages made out of surplus huts to house their veteran students. At the University of Michigan, for instance, returning GIs and their young families moved into Quonset hut communities that had been converted into surprisingly functional living spaces, complete with small kitchens, bedroom areas separated by curtains or temporary walls, and even little yards where children could play. Other institutions like the University of Minnesota, Brown University, and UCLA followed the same pattern, creating these temporary housing developments that ended up staying in use for years longer than anyone initially expected. These villages weren't anybody's idea of luxury living. The wives of veteran students, many of them adjusting to married life while their husbands studied on the GI Bill, would joke with each other about the challenges of cooking in a kitchen that existed inside a half-cylinder, about hanging laundry on lines strung between the curved walls, about the constant battle to keep the interiors warm in winter and cool in summer. But despite all the inconveniences and discomforts, these hut communities were affordable. They were available immediately rather than years down the road, and they were significantly better than having no housing at all or being forced to split up families while the husband lived in a dormitory and the wife stayed with parents hundreds of miles away. Beyond the university campuses, whole towns sprouted neighborhoods made entirely of Quonset huts. Some were converted into churches where congregations that had lost their buildings during the Depression or simply couldn't afford to build traditional structures could gather for worship. Others became diners and restaurants, their interiors fitted with counters and booths, their curved ceilings echoing with the clatter of dishes and conversation. Dance halls, community centres, meeting halls for veterans' organisations, all of these sprang up in repurposed Quonset huts. Small business owners, many of them veterans themselves who were using their GI Bill benefits to start enterprises rather than attend college, bought surplus huts and converted them into workshops where they could work on cars or manufacture products or run repair businesses. Farmers particularly loved these structures because they made excellent barns and storage buildings, providing weatherproof space for equipment and livestock at a fraction of the cost of traditional agricultural buildings. For a generation that had just lived through the scarcity and rationing of wartime, these ready-made structures felt like an unexpected gift, a dividend paid out from the massive industrial effort that had helped win the war. The story didn't end at American borders either. Overseas, the Quonset huts that had been left behind when military forces withdrew or consolidated their bases were quickly absorbed into local economies and communities. In the Philippines, which had been devastated by years of occupation and fighting, people converted abandoned huts into homes and businesses, giving these American structures a permanent place in the Filipino landscape. On Guam and other Pacific islands, huts that had housed military personnel during the war became schools, clinics, and community buildings for local populations that were rebuilding from the ground up. Even in parts of Europe, you could find these distinctive structures being put to new civilian uses. their origin as American military buildings gradually forgotten as they became integrated into the ordinary fabric of daily life. The structures weren't perfect, not by any stretch. Families living in converted Quonset huts frequently complained about chronic problems with insulation, about roofs that developed leaks as the materials aged, about the constant metallic creaking and groaning that happened when temperatures changed and the steel expanded or contracted. Winters could be brutally cold inside these metal shells despite the best efforts to seal gaps and add heating, and summers turned them into sweatboxes unless you could keep air moving with fans. But for many American families in the late 1940s and early 1950s, these huts represented something more important than mere comfort. They represented stability and opportunity in a world that was still finding its footing after 6 years of global chaos. They were a bridge, a temporary but crucial stepping stone that let veterans go to school, start families, launch businesses, and generally begin building the lives they'd been dreaming about while they were overseas fighting. They were a roof overhead, while something more permanent and traditional could be saved for and planned and eventually built. Perhaps the strangest aspect of the entire phenomenon is how some of these supposedly temporary structures simply refused to die. By the time the 1950s rolled into the 60s, thousands of Quonset huts were still standing and still in active use, many of them patched and repaired and modified beyond recognition. Owners added conventional siding to the exteriors to make them look less utilitarian, installed better windows and doors, improved the insulation, and generally did whatever it took to extend the useful life of these buildings. Even now, nearly 80 years after the end of the war, you can still find original Quonset huts scattered across the American landscape. Some are abandoned and rusting, slowly collapsing back into the earth, monuments to a bygone era that nobody bothered to tear down. Others remain in active use, serving as storage buildings, workshops, garages, or even residences for people who appreciate the quirky character of living in a piece of history. What began as a wartime necessity, a practical solution to an immediate crisis, ended up fundamentally reshaping the physical landscape of post-war America. The Quonset hut became far more than just a shelter. It evolved into a cultural artifact, a symbol of American resilience and adaptability. And like the soldiers who had lived in them during the war, these steel structures proved to be considerably tougher and more enduring than anyone had any right to expect. Even now, approaching 80 years since the last guns of World War II went silent, the Quonset hut has refused to completely vanish from American consciousness or from the physical landscape. In fact, these structures have taken on a kind of iconic status, serving as reminders of a time when American industrial might could solve problems on a truly global scale. You can still get in your car and drive through certain parts of the United States and suddenly spot them. Those distinctive half-cylinders of corrugated steel standing in fields or tucked into corners of college campuses or sitting behind old workshops. Some are in terrible condition, their steel skins eaten away by decades of rust, their wooden end panels rotted or torn away, slowly succumbing to time and weather. Others have been lovingly maintained or even restored, their owners recognizing that they possess a tangible piece of history worth preserving. But regardless of their current state, every single one of these surviving structures tells the same fundamental story about being built quickly, built cheaply, and yet somehow managing to last far longer than anyone ever intended. The legacy that the Quonset hut left behind extends well beyond mere nostalgia or historical curiosity. Architects and design historians frequently point to this World War II innovation as an important predecessor to the entire concept of modern prefabricated housing. The idea of creating buildings in factories, breaking them down into flat-pack kits that can be shipped efficiently, and then assembling them quickly on site using relatively unskilled labor. This is something we now associate with companies like IKEA and modern modular home manufacturers. But back in 1941, America was already implementing these principles on an enormous industrial scale, proving that modular design could be both practical from an engineering standpoint and scalable from a manufacturing perspective. The wartime success of the Quonset hut sparked serious discussions in the years after 1945 about whether similar mass production techniques could be applied to solving civilian housing shortages, conversations that would eventually influence the development of mobile homes and prefabricated housing throughout the 1950s and beyond. For the veterans who had lived in these huts during the war, the structures carried a deep emotional resonance that had nothing to do with architectural innovation and everything to do with memory and experience. Many of these men, when they thought back on their time in the service, remembered the Quonset huts as the backdrop against which their wartime lives had unfolded. These were the places where they'd written long letters home to sweethearts and parents, trying to describe experiences that couldn't really be captured in words. These were the spaces where they'd laughed with comrades during rare moments of respite from the fear and exhaustion of combat, where they'd collapsed into exhausted sleep after days of fighting, where they'd played cards and shared pictures from home and tried to maintain some connection to the normal lives they'd left behind. For civilians who had never served but who remembered the war years, the huts became a strange but familiar element of the American landscape, something you'd see and immediately associate with that particular period of history. They symbolized not just military power projection, but also the American capacity for practical improvisation and rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Culturally, the Quonset hut managed to earn a kind of iconic status that few pieces of military equipment ever achieve. Artists included them in paintings depicting wartime scenes. Filmmakers used them as authentic backdrops when making movies about the war, and writers referenced them as a kind of cultural shorthand when describing the wartime experience or the immediate post-war period. By the time the 1950s arrived, these structures had become such a fixture in American visual culture that they represented both the grit and determination of the war years and the optimism and possibility of the rebuilding that followed. In certain small towns scattered across the country, you can still find community centres or meeting halls that were originally surplus Quonset huts, their curved roofs now arching over dances and town meetings and Sunday services, spaces where multiple generations have gathered over the decades without necessarily even realising they're inside a piece of World War II infrastructure. The story doesn't end with historical preservation and nostalgic reflection either. In the 21st century, there's been a genuine rediscovery of the Quonset form among certain architects and do-it-yourself builders who are interested in sustainable, affordable housing solutions. The same fundamental principles that made these huts work so well back in 1942, their basic simplicity, their structural durability, and their cost efficiency compared to traditional construction methods, these principles still make sense for people today who are trying to build on tight budgets or in challenging environments. Some modern companies have started manufacturing updated versions of Quonset-style structures, using contemporary materials and improved insulation, but maintaining that distinctive arched profile that proved so effective all those decades ago. These new structures get used for everything from agricultural buildings to workshops to actual residences, proving that the original design concept never really became obsolete. It was just waiting to be rediscovered and adapted for new purposes. And perhaps what's most striking when you think about the entire arc of this story, these buildings were supposed to be completely temporary, disposable solutions to an immediate crisis. They were designed to maybe last a few years at most before being torn down and replaced with something more permanent. But like the veterans who once inhabited them, the Quonset huts proved to be far more resilient and enduring than anyone could have predicted. They became permanent markers of a generation's struggle and ultimate triumph, physical evidence that still exists in the world of a time when the entire nation was focused on a single overwhelming challenge, and managed to meet that challenge through a combination of industrial might and practical ingenuity. So the next time you happen to be driving somewhere, and you spot one of those curved steel shells standing quietly by the roadside, or tucked into some forgotten corner of an old military base or college campus, take a moment to really think about what you're looking at. That humble structure, rusting and worn as it might be, played a genuine role in helping to win the most destructive war in human history. It housed soldiers on literally every continent, providing them with shelter in environments ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical jungle to burning desert. And then, after the fighting stopped, it went on to shape the landscape and experience of post-war American life in ways that nobody anticipated when the first prototypes were being assembled in Rhode Island. In its own understated way, the Quonset hut stands alongside more famous pieces of equipment like the rugged Jeep, the reliable Sherman tank, and the mass-produced Liberty ship as a symbol of American participation in World War II. It represents the idea that sometimes the most important solutions, the ones that end up making the biggest difference, aren't the flashiest or most dramatic innovations. Sometimes what matters most is the ability to identify a critical problem and then solve it quickly and efficiently, and on whatever scale is necessary, without worrying about whether the solution is elegant or impressive. The Quonset hut's continued presence in our landscape decades after it was supposed to have disappeared is proof that simple solutions, built to address immediate needs, can sometimes cast much longer shadows than anyone expects.